Good afternoon, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens' weekly webinar series, Let's Talk Gardens. We're so excited to share information with you today. We're so glad you joined us, and we hope that you're having a lovely spring wherever you are. As always, please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. My name is Cindy Brown. I'm the Education and Collections Manager at Smithsonian Gardens, and I'll be your moderator for today. Today's speaker is Amy Mawby. And Amy, you can correct my mispronunciation if I didn't pronounce your last name correctly, but we'll let you introduce yourself as well. But before I let Amy start her program, I wanted to take a poll to see. We were talking ahead of time, trying to decide what our favorite spring ephemerals were, and the list is long. But how about you? What is your favorite spring ephemeral? So you can see a poll just popped up. Bluebells took a big leap already. And we'll see what your favorite ephemeral. We know this is a very small list and we haven't captured everything because as soon as I put it up, I thought, oh my goodness, I forgot all these other ones that I love to go out and see in the woods. In our area, we're past some of the spring ephemerals, but there's still plenty more that are out there blooming. The trilliums just started for us, so hopefully you'll get a chance to go in the woods and visit. So now I'm going to end the poll, and Amy, there you go. People's favorites seem to be by 45%, so not a majority, bluebells. But everybody is interested, and we're all very glad to learn more about. There it goes. I didn't press the final button. So bluebells is the winner, and trillium comes in as a close second. Well, thank you for voting. And Amy, we're very excited to learn more about spring ephemerals and what things are blooming in your area.
Wonderful.
I'll see you, and I'll come back on and ask the questions for you.
Okay, great, Cindy. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody out there. Again, my name is Amy Mawby, and I'm the Education Manager at Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about spring ephemerals. They're a really unique and special group of plants. Cindy asked me to kind of mention why am I speaking about spring ephemerals today. So a little bit about my background. I actually worked at a garden in New Hope, Pennsylvania that specifically focused on native plants. And so we had a lot of spring ephemerals there. It was called Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. And I was there for a little over 5 years as their education coordinator and just really fell in love with spring ephemerals. And I feel like I've taken them with me in all of my jobs. I then worked at Tyler Arboretum in Media, Pennsylvania, and now at Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens in Devon, Pennsylvania. And I've had native spring ephemerals at all of those gardens. So led a lot of programs and walks looking at these beautiful plants. So I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you. So I'm going to share my screen here and we're going to get started. All right. So those of you who may not know what a spring ephemeral is, let's kind of set the scene before we get started. So spring ephemerals are our really special native wildflowers that we find in the eastern deciduous forests where there's really rich woodland soil. The whole really neat thing about spring ephemerals is that they're trying to go through their life cycle really quickly before the leaves in the canopy come out in the trees. So they're looking to grow, bloom, and set seed in this really quick period as the ground is thawing and before the trees leaf out and block that precious sunlight. So we always say they're kind of a fleeting group, right? Ephemeral meaning short-lived. And that's their life cycle, and that's what makes them unique. So what happens to the spring ephemerals after they go through their life cycle? Well, they die back and they spend the rest of their the remaining seasons as their underground organs. So that could be a corm or a bulb or a rhizome, and also underground as seeds. And that's really good to remember if you're doing a plant inventory. So say you're looking at your own property, someone else's property, or maybe a local park or a woodland, you want to recognize that these plants, after they go through their life cycle, they are dying back, and pretty much we don't even know that they're there for the rest of the year. So if you're doing a plant inventory, you definitely want to make sure that you're looking at your property or whatever property you're looking at in early spring. So hopefully that you would catch a glimpse of the spring ephemerals that would be coming up at that time of year, and then also do plant inventories in subsequent seasons. Spring ephemerals in your garden, personally, it's kind of gardening for the long haul. A lot of the plants take about 7 years to bloom from seed. Some take a little bit less, some take a lot more. A lot of our trillium species take a long time to actually flower from seed. And I put a little note here, do not wild collect. That is tempting when you know this about spring ephemerals. You know that it takes a long time for them to get to that beautiful part of showing their blooms and their flowers, but we don't want to dig up anything that's naturally occurring. We don't want to interrupt their ecosystem, their ecology. Please let them be where they are growing beautifully. We'll talk a little bit about survival adaptations right now about those spring ephemerals. They grow low to the ground, sheltered from the cold and wind. I think a lot of people around the Northeast right now are kind of getting hit with a lot of cold, some snow. So this is the time of year when they would be coming up, and they need to be sheltered and try to be as protected as possible. So when you're looking for spring ephemerals, we want to be, this is when we're looking down constantly to look for those little plants that are popping up all over the place. They store food in underground tubers, corms, rhizomes, and that's the energy supply for them in that early spring growth. So again, when that ground thaws, these plants are able to use that stored energy to push up, and then they're going to be going underground for the rest of the year to avoid the heat and drought and to recharge and get more energy for the coming spring. So spring ephemeral pollination. The flowers, it's really neat. They actually close at night or on cloudy days to protect the pollen and nectar. And so if you are a photographer and you enjoy going out and taking pictures in spring, you need to know that. A lot of times photographers like to go out on cloudy days, but you won't be able to have a lot of good shots of spring ephemerals because they're actually closing their flowers, or you'll notice that they're a little bit more nodding. Now, that could be an interesting photo to take as well, but you're not going to get that beautiful open flower that you might be dreaming of in your head. A lot of the flowers are cup-shaped, and what that helps is to direct the sunlight onto their reproductive parts. So if you remember the words pistils and stamens, they're trying to get that sunlight and to warm up their reproductive parts, again, when it's not necessarily warm outside, but they're looking to speed up the process to get their life cycle going quickly. They may be self-pollinated or insect-pollinated. There's some good examples of spring ephemerals that if they're not insect pollinated in a couple days, they will actually bend their anthers in and actually pollinate themselves, which gives them better odds at a successful seed production. But it doesn't give a lot of diversity there with the pollen. Not cross-pollinated, again, with the insects, they would be self-pollinating. They also attract pollinators with nectar guides on their petals, or bright colors or subtle scents. And we'll talk a little bit about this really special relationship that spring ephemerals have with ants. Ants often are the ones that are dispersing the seeds. So I'm not going to tell you, if you already know, that's exciting, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what this plant is quite yet. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those adaptations and how they relate to this plant here. So as you can see, the flowers kind of closed up, and that again is that adaptation on cloudy days, or at nighttime, they actually close to protect their pollen and their nectar resources. And a lot of times what they're doing is actually knowing that if it's a chilly day or a cloudy day, their pollinators are actually not going to be active. So they're kind of preemptively protecting themselves and saying, well, my bees aren't flying anyways. There's no reason for my flowers to be open. If we look at this picture, you can see what I mean about cup-shaped flowers, that beautiful, again, kind of vase or cup shape. That is where the sunlight is going right onto those pistils and warming everything up and allowing them to get their whole life cycle going. What I like to see here is that example of nectar guides. I had mentioned before that a lot of times there might be a subtle scent in the flower, or there might be nectar guides, and you can see those pink lines on the petals up here. And those are great examples of nectar guides. And what those are saying, it's like the guy at, or woman, man or woman at an airport who's telling the airplane where to go. Those little nectar guides are telling the insects where to go and how to visit those flowers. What I didn't notice when I took this photo was the pollinator who's in that picture there. And what's really neat about this species of plants is that it actually has a pollen specialist bee. Pollen specialist bees collect pollen from only one or maybe a few species of plants. And this one is going to give the name away of the plant. This is actually a spring beauty minor bee. And spring beauty minor bee, again, is a pollen specialist bee, and it only collects pollen from spring beauty and maybe another couple plants. So what's really neat is if you can see on the anthers up here in the flowers, you can see that the pollen for spring beauty is pink. And so a lot of times the bees, when you see them, they'll have pink pollen all over them. So you know that they visited the spring beauties. So here is spring beauty. Again, really great examples of some of those adaptations. So Claytonia virginica is the scientific name for spring beauty. You can see again those beautiful nectar guides. Another thing to know about spring beauty is the underground tuber for this plant is actually kind of like a small potato, and Native Americans actually would dig them up and eat them. So maybe it's a good factoid to know if you're in kind of a survival scenario where you have to find something to eat. Otherwise, don't dig up and eat our spring beauty tubers, because then we won't have any more of that plant. But kind of neat to know some of the historic uses of our spring ephemerals. The next plant we're going to look at is trout lily, Erythronium americanum. And trout lily is in the lily family, and it's one of the, if not the earliest blooming native lily. So what you'll notice about trout lily is that when you're out walking in the woods or on your own property, you'll see a lot of these little speckled leaves. Now it's named trout lily because of the likeness to trout scales, to the speckles on the sides of trout. There's also a few other meanings. You know, it's when the trout are running is when they're here and up and blooming. So that's where our common name is coming from. But what's neat to know, let's look at our next picture, is you'll see big stands of one-leafed trout lilies. So all of these single leaves will not produce flowers. In order to produce a flower for trout lily, there needs to be 2 leaves on a plant. So it will have single leaves until it stores enough resources in its underground structure in order to have and produce 2 leaves and produce that flower. That could take anywhere between about 4 to 7 years for that plant in order to get to the point when it will bloom. So here's an example of a trout lily who is starting to bloom. So you can see that leaf heading towards me, that wonderful leaf that's actually protecting the flower bud that's sticking straight up. And then those two leaves will kind of spread out, allowing that flower stalk to really grow. And then they really put on a show. So it's amazing to me, again, to know about spring ephemerals and how they do this wonderful thing where they're closing and protecting their pollen at night and on cloudy days. Trout lily gets such reflexed petals, and then they close their petals so quickly on a daily basis. To me, that seems like a lot of work. But you can see that there's a little bit of kind of a maroonish tinge on the back side of the petals. And then they reflex open. In the lily family, a lot of times we have petals and sepals that look similar, and we call those tepals. So these are actually tepals, and there's 6 of them. And again, we're kind of opening and closing on a daily basis depending on the weather. Trout lily is also a spring ephemeral that has a good example of a pollen specialist bee. Surprise, surprise, this one is called a trout lily bee. And they're both the spring beauty minor bee and the trout lily bees, they're both insects in the genus Andrena. So again, just beautiful when you see these stands of trout lily in bloom. It's really a special sight, because again, it takes those plants a long time to get to the point where they're able to bloom. And then a little bit later in the season, you'll start to, I say a little bit later in the season, I actually mean like in a couple weeks, because they're going through that cycle really quickly. So they will produce seeds. The leaves will actually, you can see they start losing their mottling speckles. The speckles start to turn kind of a silvery color, and then they're going to die back for the rest of the season. All right, here's our crowd favorite, Virginia bluebells, Mertensia virginica. This is in the borage family. And while this is kind of a wacky little starting picture, I really like it because it gives you kind of an up close and personal view of those actual individual flowers, those bluebells that we love so much. You can also see how long kind of that back end of the corolla is, and that'll have a very special meaning for the pollinator that visits. But let's sneak in real quick and start chatting about them. So when bluebell leaves come up, they are like a spatula-shaped leaf, and they also have a lot of kind of a purplish tinge to them, and that's because they have a lot of anthocyanin pigment in their leaves. And so we'll start to kind of see little glimpses of those beautiful flower buds in there. But let's look at these couple pictures real quick. So the flowers are actually born singly. They have a lot of clusters of buds, but as they start to open, they open kind of in a single succession, which for a gardener is awesome. And also for a pollinator, that's awesome, because you're getting wonderful succession of nectar source and pollen source. Bluebells are a really important source of nectar for our early season bumblebees. They have a long enough tongue in order to make it up that little corolla tube and get their nectar reward. So let's look at a couple of these other pictures. So here we have the wonderful spatula-shaped leaf coming up. These pictures were taken when I worked at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. Again, those leaves start to come up. You see the purple tinge and you get really excited. Then you see those leaves elongating. Again, I mentioned that the bluebells are in the borage family, and borage family plants usually have hairy stems and hairy leaves, but Mertensia virginica does not. It does not have hairy stems or hairy leaves. It actually has a hollow stem, which are a little bit delicate. So while this plant can definitely take, the challenges of the season, definitely not something to go tromping through, because you might break some of the stems on the plants. But this is the magnificent show of Mertensia virginica that was at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. There was this wonderful trail called the Perry Trail, and it just was this wonderful kind of riparian kind of little lowland area, and the bluebells just loved growing there. And it was intermixed with some of the other spring ephemerals that we'll talk about today. So here are two Dicentra species. On the left, we have Dutchman's breeches, which is Dicentra cucullaria. And on the right, we have squirrel corn, which is Dicentra canadensis. They are definitely closely related, but as you can see, as the comparison right here of the flowers, on the left, Dutchman's breeches has more of a kind of a spiky look to the flowers, and squirrel corn has more of the traditional Dicentra heart-shaped flower. So when both of these species of plants are coming up in the spring season, they have this very nice ferny looking, nicely dissected leaves. But from this point, it's really challenging to tell if you have Dutchman's breeches or if you have squirrel corn. Now, of course, if it's at your house and you know what you planted, you know what plant it is, but if you're out kind of walking in the woods or in a natural area, you may not know exactly what you're looking at quite yet, until those flower stalks start coming up. And when you see, you can start to see the differences if it has those little kind of spikes or if they're a little bit more rounded. This one I will assume is Dutchman's breeches. So let's look at it a little bit closer. So I love talking about Dutchman's breeches because it's my one time of year where I get to say the word pantaloons. So Dutchman's breeches flowers look like little pantaloons hanging out on a clothesline. It's a beautiful and wonderful name for this plant because that really identifies what they look like so nicely. Pants kind of upside down, if you can picture them that way. Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn, they're both in the poppy family. The poppy family traditionally has 4 petals. And so you're probably thinking, okay, how many petals do these plants have? So what you're looking at are the outside inflated petals. There's 2 of those that are kind of inflated together. And then on the inside of the flower, there's 2 more petals, and they surround the reproductive parts, those stamens and pistils. And what is happening is they're kind of protecting that kind of inner whorl of the reproductive parts. But it is our queen bumblebees that have enough strength to kind of disengage and pull apart those inner petals and to use her long tongue to get that nectar reward. Now, sometimes if you look at Dutchman's breeches flowers and you might see little holes kind of chewed into the tops of the petals, we call that nectar robbing. There's some insects who have figured out how to cheat and they come and actually chew a hole in a different part of the flower in order to kind of, again, nectar robbing. They rob the nectar reward from these flowers. If you ever see that, that might be what you're looking at. If you have beautiful big stands of Dutchman's breeches, this is some from Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. To me, it just looks like a little fairyland. All those little pantaloons kind of dancing in the woods. It's really beautiful and massed. So as much as you want to maybe plant 1 or something in your garden, it's always nice to plant in 3s and 5s or even more if you're able. So then we see this flower stalk and this flower shape, and we know that this is going to be squirrel corn. So again, squirrel corn has that same thing. It has 2 external inflated petals, 2 tightly wrapped kind of internal petals. But again, this has that nice heart shaped, and so it's going to be squirrel corn. Another way you can tell the difference is if you kind of get down into that leaf litter, move that away, you'll see that squirrel corn actually has little nodules on their roots. And those nodules live kind of at the soil line and look like little kernels of corn, hence the name squirrel corn. That is where the name came from. So again, this is squirrel corn, and you can tell from those couple different reasons that I talked about. The flower is also supposed to have a little bit of a sweet smell compared to Dutchman's breeches. That isn't something that I've personally picked up, but maybe that's something that some of you out there have noticed. And then both Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn will create these seed pods at the end of their life cycle. Again, once these seed pods happen, then the whole plant kind of starts to senesce and die back, and then it'll lay low underground for the rest of the year. Ooh, bloodroot. Bloodroot is Sanguinaria canadensis. And this is one I would say between bloodroot and we'll talk about twin leaf. These are two of the more fleeting of our spring ephemerals. They really drop their petals quickly once they're pollinated. And if you see a flower in bloom that's absolutely perfect, you may have been the only person who got to see it in its most perfect form. The next day, it might just kind of shed those petals really quickly. So the bloodroot is also in the poppy family, just like Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn. You can see in these photos that there's one single leaf that wraps around the stem of the bloodroot flower as it's starting to bloom. And then once it does come into full bloom, that leaf will start to push off to the side, photosynthesize for a while. And bloodroot is an example of a spring ephemeral that doesn't die back quite as quickly. That leaf often stays out a little bit longer. Again, I'm gardening in zone 6B and to 7A. And so that is what I'm noticing around our neck of the woods. So when that flower starts to come up again, it's nice and closed. That wonderful leaf is protecting and wrapping around until the flower can grow a little bit taller and get ready to open. And then again, that beautiful example of a cup-shaped flower, putting that sun and that heat on the reproductive parts and really just putting on quite a show for the pollinators. But it does not give a nectar reward. It produces pollen, but it does not give a nectar reward for the pollinators that visit it. So it's putting on a show, but kind of a fake show, right? A pseudo show. No nectar reward. And then, like I said, really quickly, once it's pollinated, those petals will fall right off and it will hopefully produce those seeds and keep moving forward. Bloodroot is a great example of a plant that will self-pollinate. So if an insect doesn't visit this flower in, within like a 3-day period, those anthers will actually bend in towards the pistil and it will actually self-pollinate. Twin leaf is our next spring ephemeral, Jeffersonia diphylla. Twin leaf was the logo plant when I worked at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve, and it still is. I remember there was a factoid that in 1932, I think Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve was the only location, or New Hope, at least the town was the only location for twin leaf in Bucks County. It may have even gone past that. So twin leaf was really important to the area. And again, it is the logo plant for Bowman's Hill. It's in the barberry family. And just like bloodroot, even though they're not related, this one also does not give a nectar reward to its pollinators. Let's look at it a little bit closer. So I will never forget when I started working at Bowman's Hill, I started and everyone was like, the twin leaf is up. And I was like, oh, great. I've never seen this plant in person. I can't wait to go find it. I went up to where they told me it was. I walked the trail. I couldn't find it. I came back and said, okay, someone needs to help me and show me what I'm looking for. They took me up and they showed me this and they said, here's the twin leaf. And I took a picture. I definitely missed this. So again, plants can get through leaf litter. I know a lot of people like to rake up their leaves in the fall, but it does protect them and they are kind of trained, right, to be able to get back through this leaf litter and to grow each year. They have a lot of anthocyanin in their leaves and their flowers, and so they kind of look like, I always thought they kind of looked like little aliens growing in spring, but you can see that they're all friends, right? There's a little bit of trout lily leaves in this picture too, and those wonderful leaves are kind of look like little praying hands as they're kind of clasped together as they come out from the ground. Beautiful cup-shaped leaves, cup-shaped flowers, follows that wonderful rule of spring ephemerals. just kind of glowing in the sunshine. You can see the pollen that's produced. Again, no nectar reward, but a copious amount of pollen for the pollinators to come and pick up. I failed to mention when I said the scientific name Jeffersonia diphylla, Jeffersonia is named after Thomas Jefferson, and diphylla is named for the leaf, and the leaf you can see right here. Diphylla meaning two leaves. This leaf is actually a single leaf though. It's not a double leaf. It's just kind of pinched really close in the center. And as the season progresses a little bit, you'll see that the leaves keep growing. I almost think they look like elephant ears from the animal, not elephant ear plants, but actual elephant's ears. And you can see on the left here, this is an example of the seed pod or capsule that is produced from twin leaf. It has like a little pop top, which when I was out in the woods one day, I got to see this pop top open. And I am definitely one of those people who likes to pick and to look a little bit closer. So I did pop that little top off because I know something about the seeds, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So I wanted to see if all the hype was true. So there we are with our seeds from twin leaf. And you can see down here, picture's a little bit out of focus, but you can see that there's like a little white part to that seed. Right now, we're going to call that a doohickey. And pretty soon I'm going to give you the science word for what that doohickey is. But just remember that doohickey on the seed is important, and we'll get there in a minute. We have to introduce Trillium in the meantime. So Trillium is an amazing group of plants, kind of a showstopper in spring. The genus Trillium is represented by approximately 48 species worldwide, and 38 of those species are found in North America. The greatest concentration of Trillium is in the Eastern US, so we're really fortunate in order to see so many Trillium. Linnaeus named Trillium for threes, right? Tri meaning three. It's a great name for this plant. So you'll see that there are 3 petals, 3 sepals, 3 leaf-like bracts. Now I say leaf-like bracts because they are not true leaves. The above ground piece of Trillium is actually born out of a rhizome that grows underground. And so the plant material that's above ground is still kind of from that rhizome. So we have some different plant part names. So again, they're not true leaves. They're actually bracts that kind of function in a leaf-like manner. There's 6 stamens, there's 3 stigmas. It's a 3-cell ovary, and the berry has 3 ribs. So again, Trillium was an excellent name for this plant because pretty much everything about it is in 3s. So we're going to run through a little bit of Trillium ID before I show you some kind of named Trilliums that you'll find, or at least we do in our area. There's a lot to know about Trillium. They are more complex than meets the eye. And these are a few clues that can help you when you're trying to figure out which Trillium it might be. So some Trillium have, and they're growing on on an actual stem, and others are actually growing kind of flush to the ground. So is your Trillium, does it have an erect stem, or does it have a decumbent stem? That's one place that you can start with ID. How does the flower sit upon the leaf-like bracts? So does that flower sit directly on top of the leaf-like bract, or is there a little pedicel that attaches the flower to the bracts? If the flower are sitting right on top of those leaf-like bracts, we call that a sessile Trillium. If there's a little stalk called the pedicel, we call it a pedicellate Trillium. So we have a group of sessile Trilliums and a group of pedicellate Trilliums. When I was looking at some of the common names, I noticed that the sessile Trilliums often have the mottled leaves, and we call those toad shades. And a lot of times the pedicellate Trilliums, most of them just have green leaves, no mottling, and those are called, for a common name, wake robin. So toad shades usually have the mottled leaf appearance. And our sessile wake robins are pedicellate trilliums with a very solid green leaf, like bract, not a leaf like bract. All right, so how do the petals and sepals open? So if you're looking at the flowers themselves, the one down here on the left, the yellow petals, they will not spread open anymore. That we call those erect petals. If they do start spreading a little bit more, you can see the one on the right here. Surprise, we call those spreading petals. This one in particular has a little bit of a waviness to the edge that is particular to that plant, and we'll highlight that in a minute. And the flower in the center, you can see that those petals are twisting back, almost like that trout lily that we saw, and we call these recurved petals. So again, when you're looking at your trillium, do the petals and sepals, are they standing straight up? Are they spreading? Are they recurved back? And that'll help you with identification as well. Trillium fruit. So again, you can see everything in threes here. What's really interesting to know is that as the trillium fruits are, they don't actually like crack open, break open to allow the seeds. What they do is they kind of mature, and at a certain point, they will actually fall off of the plant. And then either they'll rot and open a little bit, or maybe wildlife will come over and kind of help to open it up, which helps me. Knowing this knowledge helps because I actually took these pictures at Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. You don't often get to, I don't often see trillium fruit on some of the plants, or I didn't at the time when I worked at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. So I saw this trillium fruit and I was so excited, and I had my camera with my nice zoom lens and I got right in there, and I actually zoomed my lens right into this fruit and I knocked it off, and I got really nervous because I was at Mount Cuba Center at the time, wasn't quite as open to the public as it is now, and I just knocked off one of their trillium fruits. But what I could see is in the back of the fruit, it was starting to kind of rot and open. And so I opened it up a little bit in hopes that something would happen. And then I went on my tour, and when I came back, what I wanted to happen happened. So here was what I had, opened up that multi-seeded berry a bit, got to see those fruits with those doohickeys. Remember doohickeys? We'll talk about it in a second. And when I came back, I saw the amazing ants coming to visit, and just exactly what I wanted to happen. This is one of my proudest nature photos. And I feel fortunate that I was able to see this in person. So in spring, there's this really neat relationship between ants and spring ephemerals. It's like a partnership in propagation. These ants are actually helping to take the seeds from a lot of our spring ephemerals, and it's almost like a little bit of ant farming. So I'm going to take a second because I'm training myself to say this word properly, which is MYRMECOCHORY. MYRMECOCHORY is the scientific word for ants dispersing seeds. Ant farming is another fun way to think about it. And what they are doing is they are interested in the doohickeys that I've been talking about. So now I get to tell you the right term for doohickey. Spring ephemerals produce seeds that have elaiosomes on them. And those elaiosomes are these wonderful little fleshy bodies. They're attached to the seed. They're rich in lipids and proteins. And what's really neat is that they have two different fatty acids in those elaiosomes that actually trigger behavior in ants. One of them is oleic acid and the other is linoleic acid. Oleic acid actually stimulates a carrying behavior in ants, and it also serves as the attractant for the ants to come and find those seeds. The linoleic acid stimulates a feeding behavior. So these really smart spring ephemeral plants are creating these fatty acids that are attracting ants to come and help them and take these seeds away and bring them to their nests. Because what ants will do is actually take that elaiosome and feed it to their larva. And then they'll take that seed and actually kind of throw it in their garbage pile in their nest, because the seed is, you know, way too hard for the ants to actually eat. And then what is happening? They just took that seed and they put it in a protected spot. And basically, again, they're like little farmers or little gardeners for us. They're planting those seeds. If that trillium fruit was left on that plant and it dropped right there, other things could come and eat it. It could be rodents, other wildlife might come and eat the fruits and the seeds, which doesn't necessarily allow those seeds to then germinate and produce other plants. So this way they're protected, they're down in this beautiful soil already. So ants, thank you. You're doing a lot of great work this spring. And some of the species that do have this relationship with ants are a lot of what we're talking about today. Spring beauties, trout lily, Dutchman's breeches, bloodroot, twinleaf, trillium, and some others like hepatica and violets. They all have seeds with elaiosomes that the ants help during this time of year. So again, MYRMECOCHORY. So a few specific trilliums, you've seen a glimpse of these pictures, but I didn't say exactly what their names were. So this is yellow toadshade, Trillium luteum. And Trillium luteum is a trillium that has, again, that wonderful long stem. And those flowers are not going to spread any farther than they are right now. I've heard that they have a slight lemon scent to them. It hasn't something that I've picked up before, but I have heard that it does have a little bit of a scent. Large flowered trillium, Trillium grandiflorum. Again, this was my example for a spreading flower. Beautiful, wavy, kind of undulating petal margins. And what's neat about large flowered trillium is as it matures, the flower actually will start to turn a pink color. And what I've read is that pink color kind of alerts the pollinators that it's already been pollinated. You know, don't come over here, don't mess up my good thing, move on to another flower where you can get all the pollen and nectar that you want. So again, large flower trillium, sometimes you will see it out in the wild, that it might have like a pinkish tinge to it as it's starting to fade. And again, that's kind of a trigger to pollinators that it's been pollinated and they can move on to another plant. Purple trillium, Trillium erectum. Purple trillium is one of its names. It's also called red trillium, also called wet dog trillium, also called stinking Benjamin. It does have kind of a malodor that it produces, kind of like a stinking smell, to attract its pollinators to come and visit. And with those maroon flowers kind of looking like flesh, it really kind of puts that whole picture together. But it's absolutely stunning. And then I threw in southern red trillium, which is Trillium sulcatum. Again, this flower is not as spreading of petals, but when it's growing and intermixed with that red or purple trillium that I showed before, sometimes it gets a little tricky on how to identify things. I know with trilliums, I gave you some identification tips, but you can go further than that. A lot of times you have to look at the color of the pollen. You have to look at the color of the pistils and ovaries. So you might want to bring a magnifying glass when you're out trying to identify trillium. And a good guidebook. Then there's various nodding trilliums that you might see. Lots of different, some are a little bit taller, some have, like you can see, maroon flowers, but all are, the flowers are kind of born tucked underneath those leaf-like bracts. So definitely a different look to that flower in your in the garden or in a woodland scenario. So to kind of end here, we're going to talk about spring companions. Unlike spring ephemerals, I kind of have this category of spring companions. They're a little bit more shade tolerant, and those leaves will persist longer than our spring ephemerals. Because remember, spring ephemerals, they do their thing, they die back. But these are also coming up at the same time as spring ephemerals, but their leaves are going to stay a little bit longer in the woods or in a garden scenario. So you can see kind of here, if anyone sees and notices and recognizes this plant down here, this is mayapple. Mayapple or Podophyllum peltatum. Both of those names kind of speak to the leaf shape. So podophyllum is actually meaning foot leaf, and peltatum means shield shape. And where the stem is attaching to the leaf is kind of in the direct center of the leaf. And we call that peltate when we're thinking about a leaf ID. And another example of a peltate leaf would be a nasturtium leaf. So that's kind of a fun fact to know. So when we're thinking about mayapple, this is what we see this time of year. They're coming up at the same time as our spring ephemerals. We have this little, almost looks like a closed umbrella popping out of the soil, and then it'll start to kind of spread open and pop up a little bit. I actually think it looks a little bit like a mushroom on this side, but that wonderful umbrella will really get popped open, and ta-da. But what's interesting to know is if we think back to our trout lily scenario, trout lilies that have one leaf do not bloom. Trout lilies that have two leaves bloom. Same thing for mayapples. So let's go back one. So these mayapples that put up one leaf, they are not going to bloom for the season. But now you see in these plants, they have two leaves. And while I think they look like cheerleaders with pom-poms, this is what you're going to look at for finding the mayapple flowers. So you can see that there's flower buds starting to be produced in the center. And then the leaves will keep growing taller, and that flower will start to kind of bend and droop down. And then you just get this magnificent show, kind of like a waxy white petal with these beautiful yellow anthers and pistils in the center. And then if they're pollinated, that wonderful mayapple fruit will be produced. Now, there's something good to know about mayapple. Mayapple actually in small doses can be medicinal and is used actually for some cancer treatments, but in a larger sense, this plant is very toxic. So leaves, every part of it, including the fruit, unless it's at this exact ripe time. But again, I am not advocating to eat this plant. It is something that maybe look into more of edible plants. But what I want to talk about is a certain type of wildlife that eats this fruit. So there is our wonderful little box turtles like to eat mayapple fruits. And what scientists and researchers have found is that the germination rate of mayapple is higher if it goes through the digestive tract of a mayapple. And they think that there's certain things going on in the digestive tract, maybe it's acids or some kind of scarification is happening. When it comes out the other end of a box turtle, I'm sure it's also in a nice little package of compost, which also helps it to germinate. But there's something going on with that kind of tummy travel in a box turtle that has a higher germination rate than if that mayapple fruit had rotted and dropped its seeds right in front of that plant. It actually has a higher germination rate when it goes through the box turtle digestive tract. So I think that's really interesting to know. And mayapple, that first picture I showed, it definitely creates, while it does create seeds and creates fruits and seeds to reproduce itself, it's definitely a clonal species, and it actually will reproduce clonally underground and make these big stands of mayapples out in the woods. And again, I'm gardening in zone 6B and 7A, and mayapple leaves will stay green through the summer months and then early summer probably, and then start to kind of die back in the woodland as well. So thank you so much. I hope you're still listening. I apologize for those few glitches there with my, apparently my internet, but I hope everything went well after I moved spaces. So I'm open to taking questions, but before I do that, I just want to put in a little bit of a plug for Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. You can check us out at jenkinsarboretum.org. Again, it's located in Devon, Pennsylvania, which is in the greater Philadelphia region. And Philadelphia is America's garden capital. There's over 30 gardens in a 30-mile radius. Most of them are open now during the pandemic. And just a wonderful spot to come and look at, some of the big hitters like Longwood Gardens, Winterthur, Chanticleer are part of the America's Garden Capital outside of Philadelphia. Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens is open daily. It's always free of an admission fee. And our garden shop, which includes a lot of native plants and azaleas and rhododendrons, is actually opening tomorrow. So we will have plants for sale if you come and visit us anytime between now and mid-October. So thank you very much. And Cindy, let's see if we have any questions.
Sure. Well, I want to confirm or echo your thoughts of the gardens in the Philadelphia area. It's where I spent a good part of my childhood, and I have very fond memories. So please go up. Bowman's Tower. I forgot how wonderful that was. You reminded me. I greatly appreciate the memories. And the gardens are terrific. So please, if you can travel, please go up and visit because they are fabulous. We have a number of questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them, but we will answer the questions, and we always put a resource page, if we can, up when we post our video to our website then later. But one of the things, I think there was confusion at the end, and mayapple is not a trillium, correct? I'm just confirm. I mean, I always want to confirm.
That is, yeah. That is totally true. Mayapple is a separate plant, a separate species. And it's more, like I said, it's more in the spring companion group, which they're at least in my area, are seeing out a little bit longer once they bloom and set seed.
And do most of the ephemerals need to have fresh seed in order for you to plant them? So it's better to get fresh seed, plant right after they're formed, or can they be dried and purchased that way and plant?
That's a great question. I'm going to admit that I have not personally propagated any of the spring ephemerals. I definitely know that they are, we are growing them in the greenhouse at Jenkins. I know that they were grown at Bowman's Hill. I have to believe that they're grown from seed, but also maybe there's something with the underground structure that they're able to do, something maybe a little bit more vegetative. That's a great question. I'm not so sure if it's from fresh seed or if it can be dried. Perhaps fresh is my answer, but I don't know that for sure.
I'm leaning towards that too, only from experience with it, but there could be a trick to it as well.
Right.
So people are curious about landscaping with the ephemerals. Is there any hints? Have you successfully put them in your garden or put them in your yard, and how? And how about mowing, removing leaves? What are some good tips for encouraging them in your own garden?
Gotcha. I don't personally grow them at my house just because it's not the right scenario, and I don't have a big enough garden for them. They definitely, if we go back to way in the beginning of my presentation, which I know was a little choppy back then, but if we think about where they are growing, so they like a moist woodland soil, very rich soil. So that's something to take into consideration. If you have a really dry spot, you might have to do a little bit of amending, bringing in some more compost, a little bit more soil there. But as we're thinking about, intermixing them, so they are, like I keep saying, they are a type of geophyte. So they can be treated kind of like your other bulbs that you would have in the garden. But they're going to differ in the sense where a lot of them, daffodils, I have daffodils in my garden. Those leaves, you want to leave the leaves until about, at least in my area, until about the 4th of July to allow them to really recharge that bulb. And then you can eventually, once they start wilting, take them back. Spring ephemerals kind of do that on their own, but there are some, like I mentioned, like bloodroot, that do kind of keep their leaves out for a little while. So enjoy them until they wilt and kind of die back. But then you can interplant those with other plants that are, again, those spring companions that will come up at the same time, but they're going to keep their leaves, they're going to keep their interest going for a little bit longer in your garden. I do know that once your spring ephemerals are in the ground, they don't really like to be messed around with. So once that spring ephemeral has established its rhizome, its tuber, its corm, whatever, it really wants to be left alone in the spot. So I would encourage you to come up with some kind of system that wherever you have it, maybe you have like some kind of marker. If you have the type of garden where it's not just a perennial bed where you've kind of established and you just maintain, if you have the type of garden where you're constantly adding things, if you're putting in annuals and those types of things. I did this silly thing this past year where I really wanted to get something in the ground, and I dug up some of my daffodils on accident because I forgot where they were. Spring ephemerals aren't going to probably bounce back quite as nicely as my daffodils did. So come up with some kind of system where like I know where these are. And then if you want to add some things to your garden bed, that's okay. But you really don't want to really mess with them. So maybe take more of the route of creating more of a perennial garden where, again, you have the layers where once those kind of die back, other plants will kind of hide them and grow a little bit bigger. But then it's a perennial where you're not having to disturb the soil or the roots to disturb those plants. So that would be would be my best bet.
Yeah, very good advice. I totally agree with that. I really appreciate you joining us today. I appreciate our audience with their patience with our technical difficulties, and we're very excited to learn so much good information. Thank you for sharing that with us. And the photos are beautiful. Thank you. It's neat that you got the ants. I've seen them, but I've never gotten a picture of them.
Seriously, it's one of those like that. I took that photo and I was like, all right, I think I'm done.
Yeah,
my nature photography.
Drop the mic. That's right. Here we go. But thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. We will put the questions that you've asked that we haven't had time to answer because we're over time now. And I know I have a meeting to go to. I don't know about you, Amy, but we will answer those in time and look forward to seeing them up on our website in about 2 weeks. So thank you all for joining us. And Amy, the kudos are just flying away. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done for us today. Enjoy your beautiful spring windy day, and we'll see you all next week when we're going to talk about how you can help local communities connect with each other. See you later. Thank you. Bye-bye. To find the button.